Well, welcome to episode 426 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by the Brazilian bossa nova group Os Poligonais. Apologies in advance to you Portuguese speakers for my butchering of the Portuguese language and pronunciation all the way through this video, which was made in 1964. It came out on RCA Victor. This is the only pressing of this record which has ever occurred, which was in Brazil in 1964. This is a sought-after, yet paradoxically little-known LP from the first big bossa nova craze in the early 1960s. Os Poligonais, or the Polygons, were a part-time band, and they were so confident that their day jobs were going to stay their day jobs that they list all of their occupations, which are not musician, on the back cover. If you're a long-time viewer of this channel, you'll know that I'm a huge bossa nova fan, but I had never heard of this record until some musically inclined friends in England alerted me to it a few months ago. I fell in love with it and with the follow-up, which came out in 1966, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to tell more people about it. There is very little information to be found about this music and the musicians on here, certainly in English or even in Portuguese with the capable assistance of Google Translate. And what I present here is, I think, pretty much what there is to know about this group of young part-timers and the great contribution that they made to the bossa nova sound. The background to this record is, of course, the innovation and then subsequently the global explosion of the bossa nova sound in Brazil between 1957 and 1962, those fertile years. Bossa nova had emerged after 1950s American jazz records, and in particular the collaborations on the West Coast between Bud Shank and the Brazilian guitarist Laurindo Almeida had found their way into the hands of young musicians in Rio de Janeiro. Those musicians included the guitarist and singer João Gilberto, the poet and lyricist Vinicius de Moraes, and the composer Antonio Carlos Jobim. The goal of these and other musicians in Brazil was to create a fusion of Brazilian samba and American cool jazz. Their fusion of those styles was well underway by 1961, at which point it was discovered by traveling American musicians, and the further blending which followed gave us one of the lasting soundtracks of the 1960s. That group of famous musicians was about 5 or 10 years older, Vinicius was even older, than the musicians here in Os Poligonais, who were just finishing high school when bossa nova breaks in Brazil in 1959-1960. The members of Os Poligonais included Vicente Salvia on piano, who ultimately proved to be the most famous musician of the bunch, the multi-instrumentalist Vidal Sbrighi on tenor sax, clarinet, and flute, the guitarist Edmar Tomy, Álvaro Galati on bass, and the drummer Pedro dos Santos Eduardo, or Pedrinho. Vicente Salvia, the pianist who became known later on as Vitché, was born in São Paulo in December 1942. He began his musical career at the age of 9, singing on what began as a radio and then I think as a TV program called Clube Papai Noel, or Santa Claus Club. He was a gifted musician. He'd begun on piano at 11 and then soon moved on to guitar, flute, trombone, and other instruments. He clearly wasn't convinced that he'd get a career out of music, because when he finishes school in around 1959 and 1960, he starts working at a bank, and he then enrolls subsequently at the University of São Paulo in the engineering program. And when this record was made, he was a first-year engineering student. He stayed for one more year, but then he made his career in music full-time. He made one more album with Os Poligonais, and then he got involved in music on TV on a program called Young Guard, which produced kind of sanitized rock music for a young audience. He works as a backup musician in the late 1960s. Then he moves to Vienna and he studied composition. And when he's finished that, he returns to Brazil. He adopts the name Vitché, and he composes over 100 soundtracks for TV and film, becoming quite well known. Vidal Sbrighi, who plays saxophone, clarinet, and flute on this record, comes from a fascinating family. His mother was of French-Polish background. She's born in Brazil before the First World War. Family goes to France, and she ends up ultimately, when she gets a bit older, studying medicine at the Sorbonne, but her dad is wiped out in the 1929 stock market crash. So they go back to Brazil. She finishes her medical training and becomes one of the very first women ever to practice medicine in Brazil. She meets and marries another doctor, a guy called Seno Sbrighi, and they become kind of a medical Mother Teresa operation in one of the neighborhoods in Sao Paulo called Lapa. And in fact, there's a street named after Seno Sbrighi, who is Vidal Sbrighi's dad. Vidal follows in his parents' footsteps. He goes to medical school. He's a medical student when this record is being made. He goes on actually to become a plastic surgeon and practices for many years, but eventually leaves in mid to late career to play music full-time. Edmar Tomy, the guitarist, who I think makes a really interesting and important contribution on this record, he stayed active in music his whole life, and you can actually find recordings of him, videos of him, up until, well, practically the month before he dies in 2011 on YouTube. I've put a link to some of those in the description. He was also the executive producer of a documentary called Chapéu Couru, which is about country music in the interior of Brazil and other kinds of folk music, and his son, Daniel Tomy, is also a talented guitarist. That much we can find out. There appears to be little information available on Álvaro Gulati and Pedro dos Santos Eduardo, the bassist and guitarist respectively, and in any event, they appear to be replaced by the time the second record comes out in 1966. This record was made sometime in 1964 in Sao Paulo. The record was actually recorded at Gravodisc, which was one of the most storied recording studios in Brazil, and which sadly burnt down about 5-6 years ago. It was produced by a guy called Ramalho Neto, who was Mr. Everything in RCA Victor in Brazil at the time, so it's also very likely that Neto himself scouted and signed the band. Vicente Salvia is on piano, Vidal Sbrighi is on tenor sax, flute, and clarinet. Edmar Tomy is on guitar, and the rhythm section includes Álvaro Gulati on bass and Pedro dos Santos Eduardo on drums. Impressively, for a young band, fully half of the track list, 6 of the 12 tracks, are original compositions by Sbrighi, Salvia, and/or Tomy. The rest of the music is basically covers of songs by established bossa nova stars. The band lasts for a couple of years. Within a year, they'd apparently been dropped by RCA. They made a 5-song EP on a label called Sawaya, which is hard to find, but you can find it, and it is on YouTube. They then had a lineup change, as mentioned, and produced their last work, which is an LP called Novas Ideias, or New Ideas, and that's on the Farroupilha label in 1966. None of their 2 LPs or their EP have ever been reissued. They only exist in 1 pressing each. What's more, only some of their catalog, the second record, Novas Ideias, is available to stream. The records do come up for sale now and then, but they're not easy to find and they're expensive when you do. However, I'm happy to say that all of their recorded output is available to stream on YouTube, and I put those links below as well. Side 1 starts with Seu e Mar, which is a great introduction to their sound because you get the flute and the sax of Sbrighi, who I have to assume was doubling and basically switching back and forth live in the studio. You get the crisp guitar, very striking, of Tomy, and the very rhythmic comping of Salvia. And incidentally, this track was written by a guy called Johnny Alf, now basically kind of forgotten, at least outside of Brazil, but one of the original progenitors of the bossa nova rhythm. Vira Bossa is a bright, upbeat track. It's the first of 3 originals on this side, and it's a vehicle for Sbrighi's tenor sax. Amor Centrifugo features Sbrighi on what I think is the clarinet, could be the bass clarinet, I'm not too sure, I'm no clarinet whisperer. A Se Eu Pudesse is a Roberto Menescal cover. Ilha das Flores is the last original in side 1. It's got a memorable melody, and it brings the guitar back in as well. And finally, Uala Ulala is a Georges Ben cover with Sbrighi breaking out the flute. His multi-instrumentalism is, I think, key to the overall sound of the band. The first 3 tracks on side 2 feature Sbrighi on the flute. Sovoda Balançou offers some prominence for the bass. Interrogação is a punchy, upbeat original. And Piper, or Piper, which is another well-crafted original, has a nice piano solo by Salvia and some very João Gilberto-esque comping by Tomy on guitar. Fuga, or maybe Fuja, sees Sbrighi breaking out the tenor sax again after 3 flute tracks. Primero de Abril is one of their more popular tracks. It's an original as well, and it was actually included on a compilation, quite a good bossa compilation, which came out in '65 on RCA called Movimento 65. And for the very last track, well, you can't have a bossa nova record in 1965 without at least one Antonio Carlos Jobim cover, this being O Amor em Paz, rendered beautifully on the clarinet by Sbrighi. This, I have to say, is an impressive record. It isn't necessarily as sophisticated a record compositionally as some of the more established stars of bossa nova were putting out at this very same time, but it conveys the feeling and the kind of spirit of the era as well as any bossa nova record I know. It's never been reissued, and maybe that'll change, but it's hard to find in physical format. But thanks to technology, we are actually all able to listen to it, and if you do so, I'm sure you'll agree with me that that's a good thing. For me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.